There is an invisible architecture to every human life, raised brick by silent brick, beam by unexamined beam, in the quiet theater of the subconscious. Imagine, if one dares, standing within the interior of an unfamiliar dwelling at the twilight hour. The floorboards beneath the feet yield with a subtle, protesting groan. A persistent, nameless draft snakes its way through the hallways, chilling the air no matter how tightly the hearth is stoked. One wanders from room to room, searching for the source of the draft, pressing palms against plaster walls that feel strangely crooked, misaligned, and fundamentally hostile to peace. It never quite feels like home. It feels like an imposition, a shelter hastily erected by invisible hands during a sudden storm, left behind for an unsuspecting tenant to inhabit. For years, the occupant paces these drafty corridors, nursing a quiet resentment toward fate, wondering why the ceiling presses down so heavily in the chamber of ambition, why the windows look out only onto barren courtyards of lack, and why the door of opportunity seems forever swollen and stuck in its frame. The architecture of the everyday existence mirrors an interior malaise. Yet, the true mystery does not lie in the hostility of the weather outside, but in the origins of the structure itself. For too long, the occupant has wandered blindly, accepting the crooked walls as an immutable act of God or a cruel joke of circumstance. But then comes a moment of radical, piercing clarity. At a table buried beneath dust and forgotten ledgers, the dweller reaches out and pulls back the heavy parchment scrolls that have been serving as the floor plan of their entire existence. Unfurling the papers, the illusion shatters. The lines are not drawn with the steady, golden compass of a master builder. They are smudged with the greasy soot of anxiety. In the margins, frantic, fearful notes are scrawled in a panicked hand, measurements dictated by limitation, margins drawn from scarcity, and structural supports anchored entirely in doubt. These are not the blueprints of a soul designed for triumph, expansion, and divine joy. They are merely inherited scribbles, passed down through generations like a cursed heirloom, drawn in the dark by a frightened child pretending to be an adult. In that singular electric heartbeat of realization, everything changes. The cold draft loses its bite. The crooked walls seem to shudder under the weight of a sudden truth. The dweller realizes with staggering force, this house was never mandatory. It was built by command. And the hand that held the pen can choose, with absolute sovereignty, to lay down the old instrument and draw a new design upon the page. To understand why this architectural awakening carries such staggering potency, one must descend beneath the floorboards of the conscious intellect into the vast, subterranean engine room of the human psyche, the subconscious mind. Philosophy and depth psychology have long wrestled with this silent titan, yet few spiritual luminaries have understood its mechanics with the razor-sharp precision of Florence Scovel Shinn. To Shinn, the subconscious is not a mystical abstraction, it is a faithful, tireless, and utterly literal construction crew. Why does the subconscious mind manifest unwanted realities with such terrifying efficiency? Because it possesses zero capacity for humor, irony, or discernment. It has no internal filter of skepticism. It does not pause to evaluate whether a muttered complaint is a passing jest or a profound existential decree. It operates on the absolute, unyielding law of mechanical execution. When an individual mutters under their breath, "I simply cannot catch a break," or sighs in defeat, things are always this difficult. The subconscious construction crew does not laugh, nor does it correct the error. It takes those casual utterances, folds them into blueprints, marches down to the quarry of infinite raw material, and begins hauling stone. How does this process translate into the fabric of daily life? Through the invisible physics of vibration and frequency, every spoken word carries an exact, measurable energetic signature. Words are not mere puffs of air dissolving harmlessly into the ether. They are ink and lines pressed onto the etheric blueprints of reality. When compounded over hours, days, and decades, these instructions reorganize matter itself. They call in opportunities from thin air or, conversely, repel them with magnetic certainty. If one investigates deeply into why human beings persist in handing their subconscious crews these catastrophic designs, the trail leads back to mental autopilot. The human brain, designed to conserve evolutionary energy, defaults to patterns of least resistance. Fear and doubt are deeply grooved trenches carved by ancient survival mechanisms. When an individual leaves their mind unmonitored, the crew instinctively defaults to the oldest, most heavily photocopied blueprint in the archive. Blueprint of survival through lack. To break this cycle requires a profound philosophical paradigm shift. The individual is not a victim of circumstance trapped inside a finished fortress. They are the perpetual architect of an ongoing construction site. Every sentence uttered is a brick laid. Every worry voiced is a pillar weakened. Recognizing this truth strips away all external blame, offering a terrifying yet exhilarating gift: supreme creative authority. If the walls are crooked, it is because the lines were drawn askew, and what has been drawn by an unconscious hand can be erased, redrawn, and elevated by a conscious one. Consider the historical legacy of Master Masterson, an artisan builder who lived in the waning years of the 17th century in a province known for its sweeping, unforgiving gales. Masterson was renowned across the realm for his stone masonry. Kings and merchants alike vied for his services, seeking out his ornate, weather-tight manners that stood firm against the fiercest tempests. Yet, despite his professional genius, Masterson's personal life was a tragedy of perpetual destitution and domestic misery. For decades, Masterson inhabited a small, damp cottage at the edge of the village, a hovel with a perpetually leaking roof, doors that warped in the winter frost, and a hearth that smoked inward rather than drawing upward. Visitors would shake their heads in profound bewilderment, asking how a master of structural integrity could endure such a wretched domicile. Masterson would only wave a calloused hand dismissively and mutter his favorite refrain: "The cobbler's children always go barefoot. My own house is built by bad luck." Every morning upon waking, before touching mallet or chisel to stone for his paying clients, Masterson would sit at his splintered kitchen table with a piece of charcoal and sketch out his day. But his hand was governed by a secret terror of poverty. He would scribble notes of anxiety in the margins of his daily schedule. Materials will run short, the client will withhold payment, the frost will ruin the foundation. He spoke these fears aloud to the empty room as he worked, treating them as pragmatic observations of reality. One bitter winter morning, a traveling scholar and mystic sought shelter from a blizzard at Masterson's cottage. As the old mason grumbled about the freezing draft whistling through the window frames, the scholar sat quietly, watching the builder's hands. Finally, the scholar reached across the table, pinned Masterson's wrist to the parchment, and pointed down at the margins of the daily ledger. "Master Builder," the scholar said softly, his voice cutting through the whistling wind outside. "You curse the weather, yet every morning you hand your inner servants the specification for a draft. You complain of a leaking roof, yet your own pen draws the unsealed joints." Masterson scoffed, arguing that he merely spoke the truth of his hard life. "No," the scholar replied, turning the parchment toward the flickering firelight. "Truth does not live in fear. You are a master of stone, yet you have treated your own consciousness like a dumping ground for the village gossip. Your subconscious crew does not care whether you are building a palace for a duke or a hovel for your own despair. They take your words as sacred law. You have ordered a drafty house, and they have delivered it with terrifying perfection." The words struck Masterson with the force of a falling beam. For the first time in his life, he looked at his daily scribbles not as reflections of reality, but as active architectural commands. That very morning, trembling with a sudden, fierce resolve, Masterson took a fresh sheet of heavy vellum. He burned his old ledgers in the hearth. Across the clean sheet, he wrote a new instruction, clear and uncompromised. "My dwelling is secure, abundant, and filled with the warmth of divine order." He repeated this phrase aloud as he worked, refusing to let his mind drift back to the old complaints. Within 3 months, without receiving a single extra coin from his trade, the physical reality of his cottage began to shift. A passing carpenter, noticing the structural decay of the eaves, offered to rebuild the roof in exchange for an old set of masonry tools. A merchant gifted seasoned timber that had sat unused in a warehouse. Within a year, the damp hovel was entirely transformed into a sunlit sanctuary. Masterson had not changed the world through physical hustle, he had changed his architect's pen, and the universe had reorganized its materials to match the new design. The lesson of the master builder is the birthright of every human soul navigating the modern labyrinth. Transformation does not require a miraculous stroke of external luck, nor does it demand an agonizing, back-breaking descent into endless psychological processing. It requires a quiet, uncompromising pause. To integrate this foundational truth today, one must begin by identifying the hidden blueprints currently governing daily life. When a sudden frustration arises, a delayed email, an unexpected bill, a sharp word from a colleague, observe the immediate internal commentary. Notice the exact phrases whispered in the theater of the mind. Are those phrases constructing a fortress of grace, or are they haphazardly hammering together another crooked, drafty wall of limitation? The practice for this inaugural step is deceptively simple, yet absolute in its power: the pause of the architect. Whenever the mind begins its familiar descent into anxiety, stop. Physically draw back. Take one deliberate, grounding breath, anchoring awareness entirely in the present moment. Acknowledge that the current circumstance is merely a physical manifestation of an old, unconscious blueprint handed down days or weeks prior. Do not judge the old wall, simply recognize that it can be torn down. With quiet conviction, replace the old mental commentary with a single, foundational declaration of creative sovereignty. Understand that every spoken word is an architectural decree echoing across the invisible scaffolding of the universe. Yet, recognizing one as the architect is merely crossing the threshold of the courtyard. Beyond the front gate lies the engine room of the subconscious, the tireless, literal-minded crew that awaits explicit instructions. How do these invisible workers process the vibrations of daily speech? What happens when casual complaints transform into heavy, toxic anchors? The journey deeper into the sacred mechanics of creation continues as the veil is pulled back on the silent foreman within. There is a subtle, atmospheric alchemy that occurs within the confined spaces of daily life, shifting the emotional climate of an entire dwelling from sunlit sanctuary to suffocating crypt in a matter of seconds. Imagine sitting in a sunlit conservatory where the air is rich with the scent of polished cedar and blossoming jasmine, a place where peace feels as permanent as the stone foundation. Suddenly, a shadow crosses the threshold, not a physical intruder, but a casual complaint muttered under the breath about the rising cost of provisions or the lingering fatigue of a restless night. In that microscopic fraction of time, the atmospheric chemistry of the room alters. The scent of jasmine seems to curdle, the warm light retracts from the corners, retreating like a frightened animal, and a heavy, leaden chill settles over the floorboards. To an observer attuned to the invisible mechanics of the world, this phenomenon is startlingly clear. The physical air has not changed composition, yet the environment has transformed entirely in response to a vibration. Most individuals wander through their lives entirely oblivious to this domestic climate control, treating their casual sighs, whispered worries, and frustrated grumblings as harmless steam venting from a pressure cooker. They utter phrases like, "I am completely overwhelmed," or "Nothing ever works out for me the first time," tossing these statements into the air like dry leaves dropped into a stream. They believe the words dissolve into nothingness the moment they cross the lips. Yet, nothing is ever lost in the economy of consciousness. Those casual utterances do not simply vanish, they descend into the subterranean machinery of the psyche like lead weights dropped into a deep well. They strike the ears of the silent foreman within the subconscious mind, which stands perpetually at its post, holding clipboard and charcoal, waiting for the master's command. The foreman does not pause to laugh at the absurdity of the complaint, nor does it question whether the statement was born of momentary fatigue or genuine intent. It takes the whispered frustration as a royal decree, issues marching orders to the invisible builders, and instantly redirects the workforce from erecting palaces of abundance to hammering together dark, claustrophobic corridors of struggle. The room grows cold because the architect ordered a frost, unaware that the tongue was holding the brush. To dissect this phenomenon with the rigor it demands requires entering the engine room of human existence and examining the precise transmission mechanisms between thought, word, and matter. Why does the subconscious mind possess such an unyielding, literal obedience? Why can a casual complaint carry more weight in the architecture of reality than a desperate, fleeting wish for success? To answer this, one must deploy recursive thinking and push past the surface layer of psychological habit into the bedrock of spiritual law. Why are words granted such supreme legislative power over physical form? Because speech is the primary vehicle by which invisible frequency is condensed into visible geometry. In the philosophical traditions that informed Florence Scovel Shinn's worldview, the spoken word is an active, living energy field. It carries an exact frequency, a specific oscillation that either harmonizes with the divine matrix of order or shatters it into dissonance. How does this vibrational translation occur within the human organism? When a thought arises in the mind, it is merely an unvoiced blueprint floating in the ethereal mist of imagination. It possesses potential, but lacks density. However, the moment that thought is pushed across the vocal cords and shaped into a spoken word, it undergoes an alchemical condensation. The lungs force air across the larynx, vibrating the physical matter of the body and sending a shock wave out into the room. This wave is not just sonic, it is electromagnetic and spiritual. The subconscious mind, which operates as an internal acoustic sensor, catches this vibration instantly. It registers the exact pitch of fear, the heavy drag of doubt, or the crisp, buoyant lift of faith. Why, then, do human beings default to speaking the language of lack rather than the language of mastery? The recursive answer leads back to the evolutionary imperative of the ego, which is hardwired to scan the horizon for danger. The ego measures reality through physical feedback, the pile of unpaid bills, the aching joint, the closed door. When the human tongue echoes what the physical eye perceives, it creates a feedback loop of staggering power. It tells the subconscious foreman, replicate what you see. If the current physical circumstance is dark and constricted, and the tongue describes it as such, the subconscious crew dutifully builds more of the same darkness. It is an unthinking mirror. The mechanical trap is sprung because the individual mistakes the shadow for the substance. They forget that the shadow only exists because of where they have chosen to stand in relation to the light of their own consciousness. To alter the physical reflection, one must stop describing the mirror and change the posture of the speaker entirely. Consider the historical account of master carpenter Valerius, who lived in the northern coastal provinces during the height of the medieval guild era. Valerius was legendary for his ability to craft magnificent timber hulls for ocean-going galleons. Ships built in his dry dock routinely weathered the most violent squalls of the North Sea without springing a single plank. Yet, despite his professional mastery, Valerius lived in a state of constant, grinding anxiety regarding his family's livelihood, convinced that poverty was a wolf perpetually sniffing at his door. Every morning, before walking down to the shipyards, Valerius would sit at his workbench and review his ledgers. As he tallied his debts and measured his remaining timber, he would mutter aloud to his empty workshop, "We are sinking. There is never enough wood for the winter, and the tax collector will take the roof before the first snow." He spoke these words with a heavy sigh, treating them as pragmatic realism. He assumed they were merely the private venting of a tired man. At the same time, Valerius employed an apprentice named Silas, a quiet youth who observed his master's habits with intense fascination. Silas noticed a strange, repeating pattern in the shipyard. Whenever Valerius spent the morning grumbling about timber shortages, the very next afternoon a shipment of oak would arrive warped, water-damaged, or infested with rot. Yet on rare mornings when Valerius woke in a state of quiet gratitude and sang ancient hymns while sharpening his adze, the afternoon delivery would consist of magnificent, straight-grained timber of the highest quality. One evening, after a particularly disastrous day, where a main beam had split down the middle during installation, Valerius sat head in hands, cursing his bad fortune to the empty rafters. Silas stepped forward from the shadows of the timber stack, holding a half-carved wooden mallet. "Master," Silas said, his voice steady and devoid of disrespect, "you spend your mornings giving precise instructions to an invisible crew, and your afternoons cursing them for following your orders." Valerius glared at the boy, ready red-faced with exhaustion. I am cursing the miserable reality of our accounts, boy. Do not speak to me of orders when the debts are piling high upon this bench. No, Silas replied, laying the wooden mallet gently upon the ledger. You are not describing the debt, you are commanding it. I have watched you for 3 seasons. Every word you speak in this workshop is written down by a silent foreman who does not know the difference between a prayer and a complaint. You told the room this morning that the wood would rot, and the wood rotted. You told the room that the tax collector would take the roof, and today he arrived with an eviction notice. You were the one who drew the plans for our collapse. Valerius fell silent. The raw, jarring truth of the statement hit him like a cold sea spray. He looked down at the ledger, filled with his own ink-stained lamentations of lack. For the first time, he recognized the terrifying correspondence between his casual, bitter utterances and the structural decay of his enterprise. That night, Valerius burned his old ledgers in the workshop stove. He took a fresh block of maple and carved a single phrase into the wood above his workbench, framing it where his eyes would fall upon it every morning. Infinite supply meets my every demand in perfect, divine order. From that hour onward, whenever a complaint rose to his lips, he bit it back, replacing it with the silent or spoken affirmation of his master blueprint. Within months, without a single external change in the economic climate of the province, Valerius's order books swelled, his timber yards overflowed with prime heartwood, and the dark cloud of scarcity lifted permanently from his house. The silent foreman had received a new command, and the physical world had instantly reorganized to obey. The transformation of Master Valerius provides a stark, uncompromising mirror for the modern seeker. The human tongue is not an organ designed merely for casual social chatter or tactical complaint. It is the master switch of manifestation. Every casual lament, every whispered worry, and every frustrated sigh is an architectural command sent straight down into the sub-basement of the psyche, where the silent foreman waits with unflagging, mechanical loyalty. To integrate this truth today requires an immediate, radical elevation of linguistic hygiene. The practice demands that one become a vigilant sentinel at the gateway of speech. Throughout the day, as challenges arise, be it a delayed flight, a difficult conversation, or a sudden financial pinch, observe the exact phrasing that leaps unbidden to the lips. Catch the complaint before it takes flight. Do not allow the tongue to validate the illusion of lack. Instead, employ the conscious interception. When the old habit of grumbling flares up, physically pause, take a deep centering breath, and consciously reverse the polarity of the statement. If the mind whispers, "This is impossible," let the voice deliberately override it with an architectural decree of absolute capability and divine order. Treat every word as if it were being carved permanently into marble, because in the invisible mechanics of creation, it is. Yet, mastering the speech of the present moment is only the second pillar of this grand architecture. The human mind, left to its own devices, drifts back toward old survival grooves with the predictable pull of a tide. How does one maintain this vigilant frequency amid the chaotic turbulence of a modern day? How can an individual interrupt the hypnotic autopilot of worry before it takes root? The answer lies in mastering the sacred rhythm of the hourly reset, where eternity meets the ticking clock in a dance of perpetual renewal. Before crossing the threshold into the next dimension of this journey, pause here for a quiet moment of reflection. Drop the heavy, invisible burdens of every complaint you have spoken this week. If this message resonates with the core of your being, take a moment to like and subscribe to this channel, anchoring your commitment to step out of the old, drafty house of accidental words and into the deliberate architecture of a new, radiant reality. There is a peculiar, invisible gravity that pulls the human consciousness backward, dragging it down from the sunlit peaks of sudden spiritual illumination straight into the flat, muddy valleys of old worry by the time the afternoon sun begins its descent. Imagine an individual waking at dawn in a state of profound, crystalline clarity. The mind is a calm, unblemished mirror. The air feels charged with infinite possibility. The heart beats with the absolute conviction that a new, magnificent reality is being successfully constructed. This person steps out into the morning world feeling invincible, believing that a single, dazzling insight has permanently altered the trajectory of their existence. Yet, observe this same individual as the clock strikes mid-afternoon. A difficult email flickers across the screen. A project hits an unexpected snag, or a minor domestic friction jars the nervous system. In that instantaneous shift, the magnificent morning insight vanishes as though it were written on water. The brilliant architecture of dawn collapses into a familiar, suffocating panic. The mind slips back into its well-worn grooves with the eerie precision of a trained animal returning to its cage, wondering bewilderedly how it lost its footing in paradise so swiftly. This paradox has baffled seekers for ages. How can a soul experience such undeniable transcendence in the morning, only to find itself shivering in the same old drafty corridors of anxiety by noon? The answer does not lie in the weakness of the insight, but in the relentless, gravitational pull of mental autopilot. The human brain, operating under millions of years of evolutionary conditioning, treats peace as an anomaly and survival through vigilance as the default setting. Left unmonitored, the consciousness drifts like a riderless horse toward the familiar pastures of grievance and doubt. It becomes glaringly apparent that a single breakthrough at dawn is not enough to sustain a lifetime of creation. Transformation is not a monument erected once and left to stand for eternity. It is a garden that must be tended continuously, a fire that must be fed hour by hour, or the creeping frost of unconscious habit will inevitably reclaim the ground. To master this perpetual drift requires a rigorous psychological and philosophical inquiry into the nature of mental momentum and the mechanical necessity of the hourly reset. Why does the human mind drift back to old patterns with such alarming velocity? Deploying recursive thinking, one must push deeper into the architecture of neural pathways and spiritual frequency. Why do insights fade so quickly? Because neural pathways are physical grooves carved into the brain through years of repetitive firing. A single morning of high inspiration is like a gentle footprint left in soft mud. The very first heavy rain of life's daily friction washes it away, exposing the deep, ancient ruts beneath. How does the hourly reset counteract this mechanical erosion? By introducing a deliberate, rhythmic pattern interrupt that forces the consciousness out of its hypnotic trance. To understand the mechanics of this, one must ask, what is an hour in the geometry of human existence? It is a microcycle, a manageable segment of eternity. When an individual attempts to maintain high vibrational awareness across an entire, unsegmented day, the ego becomes overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the timeline. The mind panics, calculating all the potential points of failure between sunrise and sleep, and promptly collapses back into survival mode. By contrast, breaking the day down into hourly increments reduces the vast mountain of transformation into a single, walkable stair. Why does breaking time into hours disarm the ego? Because the ego can handle 60 minutes. It can manage a single breath, a single interval of focus. How does this hourly intervention rewire the subconscious? Through the law of cumulative frequency. When an individual stops every 60 minutes, not out of anxiety, but out of sovereign intent to realign their internal state, they are essentially driving structural reinforcement bars into the newly poured concrete of their consciousness. Each hourly reset acts as a silent anchor, catching the mind before it drifts too far off course. If the morning insight is the drawing of the architectural plan, the hourly reset is the periodic inspection by the master builder, ensuring that every brick laid during the past 60 minutes matches the master design. Without this rhythm, the subconscious construction crew, left unsupervised for too long, defaults to copying the faded photocopies of past trauma. The hourly reset breaks the hypnotic trance of unconscious living, transforming sporadic wishing into an unyielding, rhythmic symphony of deliberate creation. Consider the historical precedent of the ancient clockmakers of the high spires, a monastic guild that lived in a mountainous realm centuries ago. These master artisans were entrusted with the construction and maintenance of the great astronomical clocks that adorned the cathedrals of the kingdom, monumental mechanisms designed to track not just hours and seasons, but the subtle alignment of the stars. Among them was an elder master named Cassian. renowned for his ability to build escapement mechanisms of breathtaking precision. Yet, Cassian's greatest challenge was not mechanical, but human. The younger apprentices frequently ruined weeks of delicate work by letting their attention drift during long shifts, allowing the heavy weights of the clock to drop too fast, shattering the delicate gear teeth in a violent spasm of metal and friction. Cassian spent years trying to teach the apprentices to maintain constant, unbroken concentration across a 12-hour workday. Every morning, he lectured them on focus, discipline, and the sacred nature of time. Yet every afternoon, precisely as the sun passed its zenith, the apprentices' minds would wander, fatigue would set in, and another gear would fracture. One evening, after a particularly catastrophic collapse that ruined a masterwork clock meant for the royal palace, Cassian sat in the darkened workshop, staring at the shattered brass wheels. An itinerant traveler, a wandering philosopher who had spent decades studying the behavioral rhythms of Eastern ascetics, sat quietly in the corner, watching the old clockmaker weep over his ruined labor. "Master Cassian," the traveler said, his voice cutting through the ticking silence of the room. "You demand that these boys maintain a 12-hour mountain climb without ever pausing to catch their breath or check their footing. You treat attention as a continuous river, when human attention is actually a series of rhythmic heartbeats." Cassian wiped his eyes, exhausted and defensive. "The work requires continuous vigilance. If they look away for even a moment, the tension breaks the machine." "No." The traveler smiled gently, walking over to the great cathedral clock resting on the central bench. He pointed to the heavy pendulum, swinging steadily back and forth, marking the passage of seconds with an unyielding, rhythmic cadence. The clock does not try to swallow the entire day in one massive, continuous effort. It moves through tiny, precise intervals. It ticks, and then it pauses. It strikes the hour, and in that sounding bell, the entire mechanism resets its tension. The traveler reached out and adjusted a small secondary gear attached to the clock's striking train. "Teach your apprentices not to hold a tense, unbroken focus from dawn until dusk. Teach them the rhythm of the bell. Every single hour, when the great chime sounds across the courtyard, let them drop their tools, take one deep, centering breath, inspect their work against the master blueprint, and then begin the next hour fresh. Break the day into sacred intervals." Cassian absorbed the wisdom like dry earth drinking rain. He abandoned his exhausting demands for continuous, unyielding perfection. The next morning, he instituted the hourly bell. When the bell rang out across the monastery every 60 minutes, all work stopped instantly. The apprentices paused, breathed, aligned their thoughts with the master design, and then resumed their craft. The transformation was miraculous. Not a single gear was fractured for the remainder of the year. The hourly rhythm acted as an unbreakable shield against mental fatigue and wandering autopilot. By dividing the mountain into hourly steps, the apprentices became masters of time rather than its victims. The wisdom of the high spire's clockmakers translates directly into the theater of modern existence. The pursuit of spiritual and personal transformation fails not because the desired vision is impossible, but because individuals attempt to maintain a complex, unbroken state of high consciousness across a chaotic day without any structural rhythm to support it. They try to leap across the chasm in a single, exhausting bound, only to exhaust themselves and fall back into old habits. To integrate this truth today, one must abandon the illusion that transformation happens through grand, heroic acts of willpower. True creation is an accumulation of small, rhythmic, consecrated moments. The practical application is disarmingly simple yet profoundly potent. The hourly anchor. Set a gentle alarm on your personal device, a soft chime, or a subtle vibration that sounds at the top of every waking hour. When that bell rings, let it serve as your cathedral chime. No matter where you are or what task occupies your hands, pause. Drop the external turbulence for 10 seconds. Take one deep, centering breath that fills the lungs and anchors the soul in the present moment. And in that sacred pause, return consciously to your master blueprint. Ask yourself, what am I building right now? If the mind has drifted into worry, grievance, or lack during the past 60 minutes, do not judge the strain. Simply reset the compass. Speak your foundational truth inwardly, realigning your internal frequency with divine order before the next hour begins. This practice removes the crushing weight of the entire day, reducing your spiritual labor to a series of beautiful, manageable, 60-minute victories. Yet, mastering the rhythm of time is only the scaffolding. Beyond the rhythmic intervals lies the actual substance of the declaration itself, the specific arrangement of words that acts as a spiritual tuning fork for the soul. How does one construct a phrase so potent, so mathematically precise in its spiritual elements, that the universe has no choice but to rearrange matter to fulfill it? The journey ascends now into the anatomy of the sacred recipe, and Freni, and Veri, and W-var, revealing the hidden ingredients of a true master declaration. There is a striking, almost jarring contrast between the frantic petitioning of the modern mind and the supreme, unshakable posture of the great spiritual luminaries across the ages. Imagine stepping back through the corridors of history into a turbulent era of famine, political turmoil, or social collapse. In the public squares, the common folk crowd together, wringing their hands, lifting tear-stained faces to the indifferent heavens, and crying out in desperate, pleading tones for mercy, for bread, for salvation from their miseries. Their words are soaked in the heavy, trembling moisture of fear. They beg, they cajole, and they hope against hope that an unseen, reluctant deity might look down with pity and alter their wretched circumstances. Yet, standing entirely apart from this chorus of supplication, observe the ancient master. Whether clad in the coarse robe of an ascetic, the simple tunic of a sage, or moving silently through the colonnades of antiquity, this figure does not plead. There is no trembling in the voice, no desperate bargaining with the divine, no frantic petitioning of an external force. When the storm rages, or the pantry is bare, the master stands still, closes the eyes, and speaks with an absolute, ringing authority. They do not ask for a miracle to be granted from afar. They declare their victory before a single physical sign of change has manifested on the horizon. To the untrained modern observer, this posture appears paradoxical, even arrogant. How can one command reality when the physical senses report only lack and ruin? Why do the masses spend lifetimes begging for crumbs, while the masters walk through the furnace of affliction untouched, speaking laws into existence as though the universe were a loyal army awaiting a royal decree? The inciting observation reveals a profound spiritual divide. Humanity at large treats life as an external power to be appeased, while the enlightened soul recognizes consciousness as the sovereign legislator of form. The masters understood that the universe does not respond to the pathetic wails of the beggar. It vibrates exclusively to the confident, resonant frequency of the commander. The ancient art of decreeing is not an act of trying to change God's mind. It is the courageous act of remembering one's own divine authority. To comprehend the mechanics behind this ancient mastery requires a rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction of the human voice when wedded to absolute spiritual conviction. Why do human beings instinctively drop into the tone of a beggar when faced with crisis? Deploying recursive thinking, one must probe the deepest layers of the egoic programming. Why does the ego fear direct declaration? Because the ego is fundamentally tethered to the physical senses, measuring its existence entirely by what can be touched, weighed, and measured. When the senses report scarcity or danger, the ego panics and attempts to manipulate external reality through begging, pleading, and frantic physical hustle. It treats the divine as an external potentate who must be buttered up with emotional displays of unworthiness. How does the practice of ancient decreeing shatter this egoic illusion? By shifting the ontological ground of identity from a separate creature begging for scraps to an integral expression of infinite intelligence itself. To answer the deeper question, what is the actual mechanics of a true spiritual declaration? When a master of antiquity spoke a decree, such as the biblical imperatives or the esoteric formulas of ancient mystery schools, they were not throwing words into an empty void. They were engaging in spiritual resonance. How does this resonance alter physical matter? Every spoken word is a frequency. When words are spoken with doubt, they carry a broken, erratic wavelength that shatters harmony, causing the subconscious crew to build chaotic, unstable structures. Conversely, when words are spoken with the supreme, quiet conviction of a master, they emit a clean, laser-like frequency that acts as a spiritual tuning fork. To understand this fully, one must ask, why did the great teachers instruct their disciples to stop using future tense hope and adopt present tense certainty? Because the subconscious mind and the universal matrix of creation do not recognize tomorrow. They operate exclusively in an eternal, living now. When an individual says, "I hope abundance will come to me," they are issuing a structural command for perpetual future waiting. The subconscious crew hears the word waiting and faithfully builds more delay. When a master declares, "I am in absolute abundance now," the subconscious mind accepts the present tense reality as a finished blueprint and instantly begins reorganizing the physical atoms of the immediate environment to match it. The masters did not hope, they knew. They understood that a declaration spoken with absolute conviction is not a wish sent upward into the clouds, but a divine decree rippling outward across the invisible architecture of infinite possibility. Consider the historical records of the Desert Fathers, ancient ascetics who retreated into the arid wastes of the Thebaid during the turbulent decline of the classical world. Among them was Abbot Macarius, a man renowned, not for his austerity, but for an astonishing inner peace that seemed entirely immune to the famine, plague, and political chaos sweeping across the Mediterranean provinces. During a year of catastrophic drought, when the wells ran completely dry and neighboring settlements were abandoned to starvation and despair, the monks in Macarius's desert community began to panic. The younger brothers gathered around the elder's cell, their faces etched with terror, weeping and crying out prayers of desperate supplication. They begged God to send rain, fasting day and night, their voices heavy with the agonizing frequency of lack. Macarius listened to their wailing from within his cell. Finally, he rose, stepped out into the blinding glare of the desert sun, and walked silently to the center of the communal courtyard. He looked at the cracked, dusty earth beneath his sandals, then up at the merciless, brassy sky. "My sons," Macarius said, his voice quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of fear, "why do you scream at the heavens as though you were slaves petitioning a tyrant? Why do you fill the desert air with the vibrations of your own starvation?" One of the younger monks stepped forward, his eyes red with exhaustion. "Abbot, the wells are dust. We are dying of thirst. If we do not plead with God for mercy, we will perish in this wasteland." Macarius shook his head gently. "God has never required your panic to remember his creation. The rain does not fall because you beg for it with a broken voice. It falls because the atmospheric conditions are brought into harmony with water. You are crying out to a God you imagine is withholding supply, while your own tongues are busy decreeing the permanence of the drought." The monks fell silent, stung by the rebuke. "What must we do, Father? Shall we sit here and do nothing?" "You will stop begging," Macarius commanded with quiet majesty. "You will step out of the posture of the beggar and assume the authority of the steward. Follow me." Macarius led the monks to a dry, rocky depression at the base of a cliff, a place where no water had flowed within the memory of the living. He instructed them to form a circle around the depression. He did not drop to his knees in supplication. Instead, he stood upright, threw back his shoulders, and spoke into the empty air with the calm, absolute conviction of a master builder issuing final instructions to his crew. "The desert is an illusion of separation," Macarius declared, his voice ringing out with crystal clarity across the dunes. "Divine order is here. Pure, life-giving supply fills this place now under grace. The earth opens its hidden veins, and the water flows in miraculous ways." He did not say this once and walk away. He repeated the decree at regular intervals throughout the afternoon, maintaining an unshakable inner frequency of victory while the desert winds howled around them. He treated the invisible realm as more real than the dry dirt beneath his feet. By sunset, as the desert temperature plummeted, a strange, earthy scent rose from the rocky depression. By midnight, a subterranean spring long choked by ancient seismic shifts burst through the cracked stone, filling the basin with clear, sweet water that sustained the community through the worst drought in a century. Macarius had not forced God's hand through emotional theater. He had aligned his consciousness with the universal tuning fork of absolute truth, and physical matter had simply obeyed the command. The legacy of the desert abbots cuts through the noise of modern spiritual confusion with surgical precision. True transformation does not belong to the person who can wail the loudest or hope the hardest. It belongs to the soul that has mastered the art of the sovereign decree. To integrate this truth today, examine the internal vocabulary used during moments of personal crisis. When a financial deficit, a broken relationship, or a health scare strikes, notice whether the initial response is a desperate plea for rescue or a calm, grounded declaration of divine order. Step consciously out of the role of the petitioner. Understand that begging for a miracle acknowledges a distance between yourself and your good, whereas declaring a truth acknowledges your inherent unity with infinite supply. The immediate practice for this chapter is the assumption of authority. Whenever a challenge arises, resist the urge to complain, explain, or panic. Stand tall in your consciousness, take a deep breath, and issue a quiet, unshakable decree that claims your victory in the present moment. Speak it not to convince a reluctant universe, but to anchor your own being in the frequency of the solution. Yet, this tuning fork of consciousness cannot be struck at random, it must be constructed with absolute precision. What are the hidden components that make a spiritual decree unbreakable? How does one assemble a phrase containing identity, present tense momentum, alignment, comprehensive good, and the ultimate grace of surrender? The journey ascends now into the anatomy of the sacred recipe itself, revealing the master words that have the power to reorganize an entire lifetime. There is a quiet, profound tragedy that unfolds every single day in the quiet chambers of sincere seekers who spend years reciting positive affirmations, only to find their lives stubbornly unchanged. Imagine walking through an old apothecary shop filled with rows of dusty glass jars containing dried herbs, exotic resins, and crushed minerals. A desperate apprentice stands at the center of the room, holding a mortar and pestle, tossing in random ingredients with wild abandon, a pinch of optimism here, a handful of financial hope there, and a heavy dose of desperate willpower sprinkled on top. He grinds them together with frantic energy, drinks the resulting concoction, and waits for a miracle. Yet, nothing happens. The fever of lack remains. The chronic weight of struggle presses down just as heavily as before. The apprentice looks up at the ceiling in utter bewilderment, wondering why the ancient formulas he half remembered failed to yield gold. To the seasoned alchemist observing from the shadows, the reason for the failure is glaringly obvious. Magic is not born from random emotional enthusiasm or the casual tossing together of positive-sounding words. A true spiritual declaration is not a lucky phrase shouted into the void, it is a sacred recipe built with architectural precision. Just as a master baker knows that omitting a single core element will cause the finest flour and sweetest honey to collapse into a flat, bitter ash, a seeker attempting to rewrite the conditions of reality must understand that a truly potent decree possesses an exact anatomical structure. Most people fail in their manifestations because they treat affirmations like casual conversation rather than precise chemical formulas. They speak words of light while carrying the heavy, discordant frequency of doubt in their hearts. They fragmentation bomb their attention across a dozen shifting desires, scattering their energy like dust in a gale. The inciting observation reveals a hard, unyielding truth. Until an individual learns the 5 immutable ingredients that compose a master declaration, their words will remain hollow echoes, bouncing off the ceiling of a reality that refuses to shift. To master the architecture of a true decree, one must perform a rigorous, psychological, and philosophical dissection of the 5 foundational ingredients that govern successful manifestation. Why do casual affirmations fall flat while precise, structured declarations instantly alter the fabric of experience? Deploying recursive thinking. One must probe deeper into the mechanics of subconscious programming. Why must a declaration possess a precise anatomy rather than a general positive sentiment? Because the subconscious mind does not process emotional wishes, it processes structural instruction. How do the 5 essential ingredients interact within the human psyche to bypass the ego's defenses and rewrite the internal blueprint? Identity. The first ingredient is identity. Declarations of identity carry supreme power because they address who an individual is at their core, not merely what they wish to possess. When a person declares, "I am whole, abundant, and divinely loved," they are not asking for a gift, they are claiming an ontological birthright. Why does identity trump possession? Because the universe does not give you what you want, it reflects what you are. If you declare yourself a beggar who needs money, the subconscious crew builds a world of continuous lack. If you declare yourself the master of abundance, circumstances must rearrange to match that core identity. Present tense language. The second ingredient is the present tense. Why is this crucial? Because the subconscious mind lives exclusively in an eternal now. It possesses no neurological mechanism to process tomorrow. When an individual says, "I will be prosperous," the subconscious hears the word will and faithfully maintains a permanent state of waiting. Shifting the grammar to "I am prosperous" now commands the subconscious to begin materializing the form in the immediate present. Alignment language. The third ingredient is alignment. Using words like harmony, flow, and cooperation signals to the universe that the individual is choosing frictionless collaboration over brute force resistance. How does alignment accelerate manifestation? By removing the internal friction of the ego. When you stop fighting reality and flow with divine order, the energy required to manifest drops to zero. Comprehensive good. The fourth ingredient is comprehensive good. Instead of fragmenting attention across a dozen scattered desires, a new car, a better job, a healed relationship, a powerful declaration addresses the totality of human well-being in a single, unified phrase. Why is unity superior to fragmentation? Because a unified focus creates a coherent, laser-like frequency, whereas a fragmented mind cancels its own vibrational signal through internal contradiction. The acknowledgement of grace. The fifth and most exquisite ingredient is the surrender to grace. Phrases like "under grace" or "in miraculous ways" remove the strain, struggle, and human hustle from the process. Why is grace the ultimate catalyst? Because grace allows the infinite intelligence of the universe to deliver results through channels far beyond human comprehension. It shifts the burden of orchestration off the fragile shoulders of the ego and places it squarely into the hands of the divine. When these 5 elements are fused into a single linguistic structure, the declaration ceases to be a human wish. It becomes a cosmic law enacted within the theater of personal consciousness. Consider the historical tradition of the master alchemists of the Levant during the medieval golden age of philosophy. These sages were whispered about in legends not because they turned lead into physical gold, but because they possessed the extraordinary ability to transform states of profound personal ruin into lives of radiant sovereignty. Among them was master alchemist Hiram, who operated a modest workshop in the heart of Damascus. Hiram took in apprentices from all across the empire, young men who had lost their fortunes, their health, or their standing in society. Most of these youths arrived with wild, frantic ideas about manifestation. They wanted to recite complex, multi-page incantations, burn rare incense, and perform elaborate rituals to force the universe to hand them wealth. Hiram would watch them with quiet amusement, letting them exhaust themselves through days of chaotic, uncoordinated ritual work until their supplies were depleted and their minds were utterly frayed. One evening, a proud young noble named Cassian, who had gambled away his family estate and arrived at Hiram's door in rags, slammed his fists onto the master's workbench. "I have recited every prayer, burned every herb, and begged the heavens for relief for 6 moons. Cassian shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Why does my life remain a barren wasteland? Why do your formulas work for others while my vessels remain empty?" Hiram did not raise his voice. He walked slowly to his workbench, picked up a bronze mortar, and placed it between them. "You fail, young noble," Hiram said softly, "not because the universe is cruel, but because you are attempting to bake bread with unground stones and scattered seed. You throw your desires into the fire like a madman tossing wood into a hurricane, hoping something will catch fire. Hiram reached out and touched Cassian's trembling hand. A true alchemist does not scream at the elements. He measures his formula with absolute precision. A true master recipe requires 5 distinct elements fused into a single, unbreakable compound. First, it must declare identity who you are, not what you lack. Second, it must live in the present tense for eternity is now. Third, it must invoke alignment, choosing harmony over struggle. Fourth, it must claim comprehensive good, addressing the whole soul, not just a fractured piece of gold. And fifth, it must conclude with grace, surrendering the method of delivery to a wisdom greater than your own. Hiram pushed a clean slip of parchment toward Cassian and handed him a charcoal pen. Write me a sentence that contains all 5 elements without a single drop of fear or future, waiting. Cassian sat down, his hands shaking as he struggled to unify his scattered desires. He crossed out line after line, realizing how much of his daily speech was filled with begging, fragmentation, and future tense delay. It took him hours of deep, agonizing introspection, but as the midnight bell tolled across the city, his hand finally steadied. He wrote a single, balanced decree that claimed his divine identity, anchored it in the present, invoked harmony, embraced comprehensive good, and surrendered to miraculous grace. Hiram read the parchment, nodded slowly, and burned the old, messy ledgers of Cassian's past complaints in the hearth. Now, the master whispered, take this formula, speak it with quiet conviction every hour on the hour, and watch what happens to the architecture of your life. Within weeks, without touching a single gambling den or begging a single relative for aid, Cassian's life completely reorganized. Opportunities arrived through unexpected channels. Old debts were resolved through miraculous reconciliations. A profound, unshakable peace settled over his mind. The recipe had worked because it was chemically and spiritually pure. The wisdom of the Levantine alchemists is the ultimate key to unlocking the power of the spoken word. True transformation is not a mystery reserved for saints and mystics. It is an exact science of consciousness, governed by immutable laws of frequency, structure, and intent. To integrate this truth today, examine the personal statements and affirmations you have used in the past. Did they lack identity? Did they languish in the weak, indefinite future tense? Were they fragmented, desperate, or stripped of grace? It is time to retire the haphazard mental apothecary and embrace the precision of the master recipe. The immediate practice for this chapter is the anatomical audit. Take a blank sheet of paper and write down your primary desire or intention for your life. Then, pass it through the 5-part filter. Does it declare your core identity? Is it locked firmly in the present tense? Does it invoke harmony and alignment? Does it encompass your total good rather than a narrow fragment? And does it release the burden of manifestation into the hands of grace? Refine your words until they form a single, laser-focused decree of absolute power. Yet, holding the recipe in your hand is only the preparation. Beyond the workbench lies the battlefield of daily existence, the sudden phone calls, the unexpected bills, and the harsh friction of the world that threatens to pull the mind back into a hypnotic trance of lack. How does one break that trance the moment it strikes? The journey ascends now into the art of the pattern interrupt, revealing how a sacred hourly pause can shatter the heaviest chains of the subconscious mind. Before stepping across the threshold into the next chapter, pause here in this sacred interval, drop the heavy, fragmented complaints of your past, and make a solemn vow to your own soul. If this architecture of reality resonates with your deepest truth, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, sealing your spiritual contract to step out of the old story and into the deliberate creation of your magnificent life. There is a terrifying, hypnotic velocity to human suffering, wherein an individual can spend weeks cultivating peace, only to be plunged back into the dark abyss of panic by a single, sharp sound. Imagine sitting in a sunlit parlor, surrounded by the quiet harmony of an orderly life, when the air is suddenly pierced by the shrill, jarring ring of a telephone or the heavy thud of an unexpected envelope sliding beneath the front door. In that microsecond, before the envelope is even opened or the call answered, a strange physiological metamorphosis occurs. The breath catches in the throat, the stomach contracts into a cold, hard knot, and the vibrant colors of the room drain away into a uniform, suffocating shade of gray. In that instant, the conscious mind is hijacked. The individual slips effortlessly into a deep, hypnotic trance of lack. A trance so heavy and absolute that it feels as though every positive declaration, every moment of spiritual alignment, and every hour of conscious architecture never existed at all. They become sleepwalkers in their own nightmare, pacing the narrow confines of a problem that has not yet even been fully understood, whispering frantic questions to an empty room. To an observer standing outside this psychological storm, the paradox is striking. Why does a single piece of paper or a brief electronic notification possess the magnetic power to shatter hours of deliberate spiritual construction? The inciting observation reveals a profound psychological truth. Human beings spend the vast majority of their waking lives sleepwalking through a conditioned trance of reactivity. The world is a theater of constant stimuli designed to pull the unanchored consciousness back into the ancient survival grooves of fear. Left without an intentional intervention, the mind is a leaf caught in the autumn wind, tossed helplessly wherever the cultural currents of scarcity and emergency dictate. Breaking that hypnotic trance requires more than a passive wish for peace. It demands a violent, a beautiful interruption, a sacred awakening that wrenches the soul back from the edge of the abyss and returns the pen of creation to the architect's hand. To dismantle this hypnotic trance with absolute intellectual and spiritual rigor, one must examine the neurological and esoteric mechanics of human reactivity. Why does the human brain fall so easily into a hypnotic state of lack upon encountering a crisis? Deploying recursive thinking, one must descend into the evolutionary biology of the ego. Why is the nervous system wired to default to panic rather than peace? Because for millions of years, survival depended on instantaneous reaction to external threats. The tiger in the bushes required an immediate, non-negotiable fight-or-flight response. How does this ancient survival mechanism hijack modern consciousness? When an unexpected bill or difficult news arrives, the amygdala fires instantly, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline. This chemical surge creates a narrow, tunnel vision focus on the perceived threat. The conscious mind goes offline, and the subconscious, operating on its deep, well-worn grooves of past trauma and cultural scarcity, takes complete control. The individual is no longer responding to the present reality. They are sleepwalking through a holographic projection of past fears. How does one break this chemical and hypnotic cycle? By understanding the philosophical necessity of the pattern interrupt. To answer the deeper question, what is the actual mechanics of an intervention? A hypnotic trance can only be maintained as long as the internal narrative remains uninterrupted. If a sleepwalker is walking toward a cliff, shouting arguments at them will only pull them deeper into their dream. They must be physically shaken or jarred by a sudden, distinct signal that forces the eyes wide open. Why is a scheduled hourly pause or the sudden intentional declaration the ultimate pattern interrupt? Because it introduces an unconditioned, high-frequency variable into a closed, low-frequency loop. When an individual stops mid-panic, takes a deliberate breath, and speaks a master decree, they are essentially introducing a foreign, divine code into a corrupt computer program. The neurological pathways of panic are abruptly short-circuited. The chemical flood recedes. The conscious mind re-enters the body, reclaiming the throne of sovereignty. The subconscious crew, which was frantically beginning to build a fortress of despair in response to the bad news, pauses mid-brick, drops its tools, and awaits the new, calm instruction of the architect. Breaking the trance is not an act of passive relaxation, it is an act of spiritual reclamation. Consider the historical records of the lighthouse keepers of Cape Wrath, a legendary guild of mariners who manned the most isolated, storm-battered beacon on the northern edge of the realm. These keepers lived in an environment where reality was a constant onslaught of sensory terror. Towering waves crashing against the stone foundations, howling gales threatening to rip the roofs from their quarters, and the perpetual, disorienting darkness of endless winter nights. In such conditions, novice keepers frequently fell into a psychological state known among the guild as the gray stupor. Exhausted by the ceaseless roaring of the storm and terrified by the isolation, a keeper would slip into a hypnotic trance of despair. He would sit by the cold hearth, staring blankly at the floor, forgetting to wind the clockwork mechanism that turned the great lens. As the lens stopped turning, the beacon went dark, and ships in the channel were driven toward the jagged reefs. The storm outside had not changed, but the keeper's internal trance had paralyzed his ability to act as a guardian of the light. Among the master keepers was an elder named Thorstein, who had spent 40 years on the Cape without ever losing a ship to the rocks. When a novice fell into the gray stupor, Thorstein did not offer sympathetic counseling or gentle words. He used a brutal, effective method known as the strike of the bell. In the center of every watchtower hung a massive bronze bell, installed not to signal the time of day, but to shatter the hypnotic trances induced by the ocean's roar. Whenever Thorstein noticed a keeper staring blankly into the fire, consumed by the terror of the storm, he would walk over to the cord and strike the bronze bell with a heavy wooden mallet. Clang! The sound was deafening. It vibrated through the floorboards, shook the dust from the rafters, and pierced straight through the psychological fog enveloping the novice's mind. One winter night, during a hurricane that threatened to tear the tower apart, a young keeper named Jorik sat frozen in the corner of the engine room. A section of the outer wall had collapsed, letting in a howling blast of freezing spray and the terrifying screech of grinding timber. Jorik sat with his head in his hands, muttering over and over that they were doomed, that the sea would swallow them all before morning. He was deep within the hypnotic trance of destruction, his mind building a monument to their own demise. Thorstein walked calmly through the freezing spray, stepped up to the bronze bell, and struck it twice with all his might. The rich resonant wave of sound crashed through the room, cutting across the roar of the hurricane like a sword of light. Jorik jerked violently, gasping for breath as though he had just been pulled from deep water. He looked up, his eyes wide and wild with terror. "Master, the wall has breached." Jorik screamed over the wind. "We are drowning. The storm has won." Thorstein grabbed the young man by the shoulders, pulling him to his feet. "The storm is merely weather, Jorik. You were drowning in your own mind long before the sea touched these stones. You sat there building a grave with your panic. Listen to the bell. Wake up." Jorik blinked, the fog clearing from his mind as the vibration of the bell resonated in his chest. He looked at the unmoving machinery of the lens, then at Thorstein's calm, unshakable face. "What must I do?" Jorik whispered, his voice steadying. "You must interrupt the trance," Thorstein replied, handing him the winding crank. "Do not fight the storm outside, anchor the light inside, wind the clockwork, speak your post, let the beacon turn." Jorik seized the crank. He began to wind the great brass gears, repeating the safety decree of the keepers under his breath with every rotation. The hypnotic spell was broken. The tower light swept its brilliant beam across the dark, violent ocean once more, guiding ships safely through the chaos. The storm raged on for 3 days, but Jorik never slipped back into the gray stupor, because he had learned the sacred secret of the pattern interrupt. The wisdom of the Cape Wrath lighthouse keepers is an indispensable tool for navigating the turbulent seas of modern existence. The world will always howl. Difficult emails will arrive, unexpected bills will land upon the threshold, and sudden crises will test the limits of human endurance. These events are not aberrations, they are the natural weather of a physical dimension. The danger does not lie in the storm outside, but in the hypnotic trance of panic it induces within the human soul. To integrate this truth today, one must establish a personal system of pattern interrupts. When a sudden crisis strikes, and the familiar physiological symptoms of panic begin to take hold, when the stomach tightens, and the thoughts begin to race toward catastrophe, recognize that you have slipped into the gray stupor. Do not attempt to reason with the panic while you are inside it. You cannot logic your way out of a trance, using the same mind that fell into it. Instead, execute the bell strike. Stop whatever you are doing. Take one sharp, deep, deliberate breath that acts as an internal acoustic shockwave. If you are alone, speak a master declaration aloud with sudden, unshakable force to shatter the mental fog. Break the hypnotic loop before it has time to write its fearful blueprints in the subconscious mind. Anchor your consciousness back in the present moment, where infinite power and divine order reside. Yet, breaking the trance is only the clearing of the ground. Once the mind is awake and the slate is wiped clean, what is the currency that must be deposited into the universal treasury to ensure permanent manifestation? How do small, repeated acts of faith accumulate across time until they crystallize into physical form? The journey ascends now into the mystery of spiritual deposits and the steady, nourishing river of continuous creation. There is a profound, illusionary trap that plagues the human concept of effort. The belief that transformation is a thunderous, singular flood rather than a persistent, silent accumulation of single drops. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, parched desert basin where the earth has baked into a rigid crust of cracked clay under a relentless sun. For years, observers have waited for the rare, catastrophic monsoon, that sudden, violent wall of water that tears across the landscape, carving deep, destructive arroyos, uprooting ancient trees, and washing away everything in its path before vanishing just as quickly as it arrived, leaving the desert drier and more desolate than before. Most human beings approach their personal evolution with the psychology of the monsoon, hoping for one massive, dramatic breakthrough that will instantly wash away a lifetime of limitation in a single afternoon. Yet, observe an entirely different phenomenon occurring miles away in a hidden mountain gorge, a steady, unassuming spring that releases a single, crystal drop of water every few seconds. That drop falls with negligible force, making barely a whisper against the moss. It cannot wash away mountains, nor can it shatter boulders in an instant. Yet, as those drops accumulate hour after hour, day after day, through every season of the year, they form a steady, nourishing river. That quiet river winds its way down into the desert basin, transforming the cracked clay into a lush, vibrant oasis filled with emerald reeds, towering palms, and blossoming life. The inciting observation reveals a timeless paradox. The dramatic breakthrough that everyone prays for is almost always an illusion, while the quiet, uncelebrated accumulation of consistent, daily deposits is the true hidden engine of creation. The universe does not respond to the erratic flood of emotional desperation. It yields entirely to the steady, compound interest of sustained, focused faith. The individual who understands this law stops waiting for the skies to open with miraculous lightning, and instead picks up the quiet chisel of hourly repetition, knowing that every single declaration deposited into the subconscious treasury brings them closer to the critical mass of physical manifestation. To examine the mechanics of spiritual accumulation with absolute precision requires a rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction of how habits, beliefs, and physical realities are forged over time. Why do human beings consistently underestimate the staggering power of small, repeated actions, preferring instead the false security of monumental effort? Deploying recursive thinking, one must probe deep into the architecture of the human ego and its addiction to immediate, visible feedback. Why does the ego crave dramatic breakthroughs? Because the ego is impatient, fragile, and terrified of the invisible stage of growth where no physical evidence of success can be seen. How does this impatience sabotage manifestation? When an individual attempts a new spiritual practice for 3 days and sees no immediate, physical alteration in their bank account or relationships, the ego panics, declares the practice a failure, and abandons it entirely. The individual mistakes the invisible germination period for total barrenness. How does the law of consistent deposits bypass this egoic trap? By recognizing that all beliefs are stubborn psychological grooves, deeply worn trenches carved into the nervous system through years of repetitive conditioning. To answer the deeper question, what is the exact psychological mechanism of a belief? A belief is not a single thought. It is a compound structure built of thousands of microscopic mental impressions laid down over decades. A single positive thought cannot erase a lifetime of inherited doubt, any more than a single drop of water can instantly dissolve a boulder. Why do hourly declarations achieve what sporadic affirmations cannot? Because of the mechanics of neuroplasticity and spiritual compounding. Every time an individual stops at the top of the hour and repeats their master decree with feeling, they are depositing a unit of spiritual currency into the subconscious account. How does this currency accumulate? The first 50 deposits sink into the soil of the mind without leaving a mark on the physical surface. The next 100 deposits begin to soften the hard clay of old resistance. By the time the 1000th deposit is made, a critical mass is reached, the internal neural groove is overwritten. The subconscious construction crew, having received hundreds of identical, uninterrupted orders, finally halts its old work and begins hauling the physical materials of manifestation into the outer world. The universe does not reward the intensity of a single prayer. It compounds the frequency of persistent conviction. The individual who masters the art of the steady deposit becomes an unstoppable force of nature, not through brute aggression, but through the quiet, inexorable power of compounding spiritual interest. Consider the historical chronicles of the master stonemasons of Chartres, who labored across centuries to raise the great cathedrals of medieval Europe. These magnificent structures, soaring upward toward the heavens, with intricate stained glass windows and towering spires, were never built by a single architect's flash of inspiration, nor were they erected in a single season of feverish labor. Among them was Master Mason Giles, who spent over 40 years working on the western facade of a cathedral that was still only half finished when he inherited the position from his father. Giles observed young apprentices arriving at the site with grand, romantic notions of glory. They wanted to carve the central rose window on their very first week, or design soaring flying buttresses that would astonish the king. When assigned the monotonous daily task of squaring limestone blocks and laying them uniformly line by line, hour by hour, these impatient youths quickly grew bored, careless, or exhausted, abandoning the yard before their first winter was through. Giles, however, possessed the secret of the deposit. Every morning at dawn, before touching his chisel to stone, he stood silently before the wall, affirming the divine order of the work. Throughout the day, whenever the bell tolled the hour, Giles stopped his heavy mallet, inspected his alignment, and laid another single, perfect stone. He did this not with a sense of desperate urgency, but with a quiet, unshakable rhythm. One spring, a visiting nobleman, appalled by the slow, seemingly endless crawl of the construction, approached Giles in the dusty yard. "Master Mason," the nobleman demanded, pointing up at the half-finished towers against the gray sky. "You have labored here for 30 years, and yet the roof is still open to the rain. Why do you not summon 1,000 men, double the wages, and finish this house of God in a single season of glory?" Giles wiped the limestone dust from his brow, smiled calmly, and shook his head. "My lord, a cathedral is not built by a storm of men throwing stones in a panic. It is built by the quiet accumulation of single blocks laid in faith. If I attempted to raise this tower in a frantic rush, the foundations would crack under their own weight, and the walls would collapse into the mud before the first winter frost." "And how do you know it will ever be finished?" the nobleman sneered, "when you are only laying one small stone each hour?" "I do not worry about the finished roof," Giles replied, picking up his mallet with serene authority. "My task is not to build the cathedral in my mind all at once. My task is to make this single hour's deposit perfect. Every stone laid with true intent is a coin dropped into the universal treasury. The treasury compounds the interest silently, invisibly, until one day the critical mass is reached, and the walls have no choice but to stand complete." The nobleman scoffed and rode away, dismissing the old mason as a slow-moving eccentric. Yet, 20 years later, long after the nobleman had passed into oblivion, that very cathedral stood finished in all its breathtaking glory, a masterpiece of light and stone that outlasted kingdoms, because every square inch of it had been built upon the unyielding, compound interest of consistent, hourly deposits. The wisdom of the cathedral masons cuts straight to the core of modern spiritual practice. Transformation fails not because the desired outcome is unattainable, but because the seeker abandons the chisel during the invisible, unglamorous stages of accumulation. They look at their current bank account, their healing body, or their relationships, and because the physical senses report no immediate change, they panic and throw down their tools. To integrate this truth today, one must abandon the anxiety of the timeline. Recognize that every time you execute your hourly reset, every time you speak your master decree with quiet conviction, you are making an invisible deposit of spiritual currency into the universal bank. Those deposits do not vanish. They accumulate interest in the realm of consciousness long before they crystallize into physical form. The practical exercise for this chapter is the ledger of consistency. Commit yourself for the next 7 days to not missing a single hourly bell. Do not judge whether your life is changing on day 2 or day 3. Simply make your deposit. Treat each hour as a sacred coin dropped into the treasury of your future reality. Understand that the sudden breakthrough you desire is merely the compounding interest of 1,000 small, faithful acts of alignment. Yet, making deposits requires an account to deposit into and a specific currency to spend. What is the exact phrasing of the Master Declaration that holds every necessary element of divine creation? How do identity, present tense, alignment, comprehensive good, and grace fuse together into a single phrase of supreme power? The journey ascends now to the unveiling of the Master Blueprint itself, the precise words that have the power to reorganize an entire existence. There is a profound, breathless hush that falls over a sanctuary when the great clock tower finally strikes the hour, signaling the exact instant where eternity intersects with human time. Imagine standing within the stone-vaulted nave of an ancient cathedral at high noon. Outside, the world is a chaotic tempest of dust, commerce, and human clamor. But inside, the air is heavy with the scent of old beeswax and cool marble. A solitary seeker sits in the center pew, eyes closed, breathing slowly as the cathedral bells begin their deep, resonant toll. As the final stroke fades into the high rafters, a profound quiet settles over the space. This is the sacred threshold, the precise, fertile moment where the old, drafty house of the past is left behind, and the clean parchment of the present is laid out upon the table. For weeks, the traveler has studied the architecture of consciousness, learned the silent obedience of the subconscious foreman, mastered the rhythm of the hourly reset, discarded the wails of the beggar for the sovereign posture of the master, audited the anatomical recipe of thought, shattered the hypnotic trances of panic, and understood the compound interest of spiritual deposits. All of this preparation, every brick laid, every mental groove rewritten has led inexorably to this singular heartbeat. Yet, knowing the mechanics of building is not the same as holding the golden key to the master door. The seeker opens their eyes, exhales the last remnants of doubt, and looks toward the altar where the Master Declaration rests, waiting to be spoken aloud. The inciting observation presents the ultimate spiritual paradox. The human mind spends a lifetime searching across oceans, sacred texts, and hidden temples for a complex, esoteric secret to life, only to discover that the master key of the universe is a phrase so elegant, so deceptively simple, that a child could speak it. Yet, when voiced with absolute conviction by a soul anchored in divine order, it possesses the raw, cataclysmic power to shatter mountains of lack and reorganize the physical atoms of reality. To understand why this specific sequence of words carries such breathtaking potency requires a rigorous psychological and philosophical dissection of the master phrase itself. Why does this precise arrangement of syllables act as the supreme tuning fork of the soul? Deploying recursive thinking, one must examine each architectural component to see how it forces both the subconscious mind and the universal matrix to yield. Why does the declaration open with "I am"? Because these two words represent the uncreated name of God anchored within human form. They bypass the ego's identity as a victim of circumstance and immediately establish ontological sovereignty. When an individual declares "I am," they are not wishing or becoming, they are being. The subconscious foreman hears "I am" as an absolute, non-negotiable statement of fact, and immediately begins constructing a reality that honors that identity. How does imperfect harmony alter the psychological and spiritual landscape? It instantly neutralizes resistance. The ego loves struggle. It believes that good things must be fought for, bled for, and earned through exhaustion. The phrase "in perfect harmony" commands the nervous system to drop its weapons. It replaces friction with frictionless flow, aligning the individual with the natural, effortless rhythm of the cosmos. Why the escalation to with infinite abundance? The human mind is chronically addicted to scarcity, measuring supply through finite bank accounts, limited job openings, and narrow romantic prospects. By declaring infinite abundance, the seeker shatters all perceived boundaries. The storehouse of the divine is boundless. The phrase forces the subconscious to stop looking at local puddles and turn its gaze toward the limitless ocean. How does the inclusion of "and all good things" achieve comprehensive unity? Instead of fragmenting attention across a dozen narrow, competing desires, health, wealth, peace, love, this sweeping clause gathers every possible blessing into a single, cohesive vibration. It ensures that prosperity does not come at the expense of health, and that peace does not exclude material supply. It is a unified field theory of spiritual good. Why does "flow to me now" dissolve the barrier of time? The ego loves the future tense, always waiting, always delaying gratification until tomorrow. The word "now" yanks manifestation out of the hazy horizon and drops it directly into the present heartbeat. Coupled with "flow to me," it commands supply to move toward the seeker effortlessly, like water finding the lowest point of a basin, eliminating the need to chase or hustle. How does the concluding cadence "under grace in miraculous ways" complete the alchemy? This is the ultimate surrender. Human logic is narrow. It can only imagine solutions derived from past trauma and existing limitations. By invoking grace in miraculous ways, the seeker absolves themselves of the burden of how the manifestation will occur. Grace removes the sweat, the strain, and the human orchestration, allowing infinite intelligence to deliver the good through channels so unexpected, so breathtakingly marvelous, that the ego could never have planned or conceived them. The master blueprint is not merely a sentence, it is a complete spiritual technology encoded into human language. Consider the historical precedent of master alchemist Kalin, who lived in a remote valley monastery during an era of profound societal collapse. The surrounding provinces had fallen into ruin. The local currency was worthless, the fields were barren from years of blight, and the monastery itself was on the verge of being abandoned, its roof timbers rotting and its library buried under dust. The younger monks had fallen into a deep, collective despair. They spent their days wandering the drafty cloisters, whispering of poverty, arguing over dwindling rations, and writing fearful letters to neighboring regions begging for charity. Kalin, however, spent his hours alone in the scriptorium. He had spent decades studying the ancient parchment scrolls left by Florence Scovel Shinn and the forgotten masters of antiquity. He knew that the monks were starving not because the universe lacked bread, but because their collective consciousness was anchored entirely in the blueprint of lack. One bitter winter evening, as the monastery council gathered in the freezing refectory to discuss selling off their sacred library to pay their debts, Kalin stood up from his seat at the end of the long oak table. "We will sell nothing," Kalin said, his voice ringing through the cold stone room with absolute, unshakable calm. The abbot looked up, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Kalin, we have no coin in the coffer, no grain in the cellar, and the winter wind is freezing our brothers in their cells. What madness is this? How shall we survive if we do not mortgage our legacy?" "You survive," Kalin replied quietly, walking to the center of the room and standing beneath the drafty timber beams, by putting down the pen of the beggar and picking up the master blueprint. Kalin did not offer a complex, exhausting ritual, nor did he suggest writing letters of petition to distant nobles. He instructed the monks to gather in the chapel at the striking of the midnight bell. When they had assembled, shivering in their worn robes, Kalin told them to stop their wailing, take one deep, centering breath, and speak a single, unified declaration aloud in unison. He taught them the master phrase, "I am in perfect harmony with infinite abundance, and all good things flow to me now under grace in miraculous ways." At first, the monks muttered the words hesitantly, their voices weak and laced with doubt. But Kalin made them repeat it every single hour when the chapel bell rang. Throughout the night, through the freezing dawn, and into the following days, the monks maintained the rhythm. Whenever anxiety rose, the bell rang, and they anchored themselves in the master phrase. Within a fortnight, the physical reality of the valley began to shift in ways that defied all human logic. A traveling caravan of merchants, delayed by an unexpected rockslide on the high pass, was forced to seek shelter at the monastery gates. Upon arrival, their leader revealed they carried excess stores of grain that would spoil if not unloaded immediately, donating the surplus freely to the monks. A wealthy traveler, passing through the province, was so struck by the radiant peace and absolute serenity on the faces of the monastery brothers that he endowed the order with a substantial trust, insisting his identity remain anonymous. The roof timbers were repaired, the granaries overflowed, and the community flourished. Kalin had not changed the world through physical hustle. He had given the silent subconscious crew the master blueprint, and reality had reorganized itself with miraculous precision. The Chronicle of Master Kalin's monastery is the living proof of what is possible when human consciousness aligns with the master blueprint. Transformation is not an elusive ghost dancing just out of reach. It is a mechanical, spiritual reality waiting to be commanded into form by a sovereign soul. To integrate this truth today, you must commit the master phrase to the very marrow of your being. Write it upon your heart. Set your personal alarm to chime at the top of every waking hour. When that bell sounds, let it be your cathedral chime. Pause. Take one deep, centering breath. Drop all external friction, and speak these words aloud with the quiet, absolute conviction of a master builder. I am in perfect harmony with infinite abundance, and all good things flow to me now under grace in miraculous ways. Feel the identity of the I Am. Feel the friction vanish into perfect harmony. Feel the boundaries dissolve into infinite abundance. Feel the total embrace of all good things. Feel the present moment urgency of flow to me now. And feel the sweet, weightless surrender of under grace in miraculous ways. Yet, speaking the blueprint is only the beginning of the journey. Once the seed is planted in the rich soil of consciousness, what happens during the silent, gradual days before the harvest? How does the internal mirror reflect these invisible shifts into the external world of form? The journey ascends now into the gradual blossoming of the soul, where internal conversation becomes the architect of a brand new world. There is a subtle, almost imperceptible alchemy that takes place in the quiet spaces between days, where an individual who has committed to the hourly discipline suddenly looks up and realizes the world outside has changed its face. Imagine an old craftsman standing before a massive, centuries-old bronze mirror that hangs upon the wall of a dimly lit workshop. For years, that mirror has reflected a desolate, cluttered room filled with broken tools, cracked furniture, and shadows that seem to press inward with the weight of inescapable decay. Every time the artisan gazes into the glass, he scowls at the wretched reflection, cursing the room, cursing the glass, and cursing the cruel fate that placed him within such wretched surroundings. Yet, one morning, after weeks of tending a quiet, internal fire and speaking a new master blueprint into the air every single hour, the craftsman walks over to the bronze plate. He does not wipe the glass, nor does he move a single piece of broken furniture with his hands. Instead, as he raises his eyes, he gasps. The bronze mirror no longer shows a dark and claustrophobic tomb. The glass gleams with a warm, amber light. The broken tools have vanished, replaced by polished instruments of gold and silver, and the air within the reflection is clear, vibrant, and alive with possibility. Yet, when the artisan turns around to look at his physical workshop behind him, he notices a strange paradox. The physical walls of the room are still the same ancient stone. The heavy oak workbench is still scarred with old cuts. Nothing in the external room has been violently demolished or instantly rebuilt by an earthquake. And yet, the room is entirely different. It feels lighter, warmer, and profoundly sacred. The inciting observation reveals the profound, hidden law of manifestation. The external world is nothing more than a living mirror reflecting the private, unmonitored conversation of the human soul. Change the inner conversation, And you change the world, not through a sudden magic trick of instant physical rearrangement, but through a gradual, internal shift that eventually reaches a critical mass, blooming into undeniable, glorious external reality. To dissect this mirroring mechanism with absolute psychological and philosophical rigor, one must examine the transitional phase between internal decree and external demonstration. Why does manifestation so often appear to happen gradually and then suddenly? Deploying recursive thinking, one must push past the surface level of emotional relief into the deep machinery of consciousness and form. Why is the external world constructed as a mirror rather than an independent reality? Because matter itself is malleable. In the esoteric physics that guided Florence Scovel Shinn's realizations, the physical plane is merely the shadow of the mental plane. How does this shadow respond to the hourly reset? When an individual begins practicing the hourly declaration, the first shifts do not occur in the bank account or the physical environment. They occur in the microscopic architecture of awareness. Why are these subtle internal shifts initially invisible to the physical senses? Because the density of past karma and deeply grooved neural pathways possesses a certain momentum, like a heavy freight train slowing down. When the engineer slams on the brakes, the train does not stop instantly. It continues gliding forward for a long distance on sheer inertia, even though the engine has reversed direction. How does the practitioner navigate this treacherous interval between the inner shift and the outer reflection? This is the sacred incubation period, the testing ground of gentle faith. To answer the deeper question, what is the exact mechanism that tips the scale from gradual internal adjustment to sudden external breakthrough? It is the law of critical mass. Every time an individual executes an hourly reset, they add another drop of pure water into a vessel filled with murky, stagnant belief. For days, the water remains dark, the eye sees no difference, but the ratio of purity is shifting silently beneath the surface. Then, upon the drop of a single hour, the tipping point is reached. The water suddenly clarifies completely. The internal alignment hits a threshold of coherence where the subconscious construction crew, having received thousands of unwavering instructions, drops its old tools for the last time and finishes the palace. The external world, which had been gliding on the inertia of past, collides with the new frequency and is forced to reorganize itself overnight. The gradual phase of discipline transitions effortlessly into the sudden breakthrough of automatic knowing. The soul no longer needs to force the practice has become the soul's natural breath. Consider the historical chronicles of master artisan Leander, who lived in the island workshops of Murano during the height of the glass-blowing Renaissance. Leander was tasked with creating the grand chandelier for the Doge's palace, a monumental work of crystal and light that was expected to be a marvel of the Western world. Yet, when Leander began his labor, his workshop was cursed with poor materials. The silica sand was contaminated with iron, turning his molten glass a dull, muddy green, and his apprentice crew was fractious, exhausted, and constantly dropping the fragile globes in despair. Leander found himself shouting at the furnace, cursing the sand, and despairing that he would ever produce a work fit for a palace. Among his apprentices was a quiet boy named Valerio, who observed his master's daily torment. Valerio had learned a secret from an old Levantine traveler concerning the discipline of the mirror. One evening, after Leander had stormed out of the workshop in disgust, leaving a room full of ruined, greenish glass behind, Valerio stayed behind. He did not throw out the tainted sand. Instead, he walked over to the polishing station, took a soft cloth, and began to polish the large, soot-stained bronze mirror that hung beside the furnace. As he polished the glass hour after hour, he spoke a quiet decree over the workshop. Infinite intelligence works perfectly through me, and my every word creates my ideal reality. He repeated this discipline every single hour when the bell of street marks tolled across the lagoon. Leander returned the next morning, expecting to find the workshop in total ruin. Instead, he found Valerio sitting quietly by the cooling oven, humming a gentle tune. "Boy, have you lost your senses?" Leander roared, waving his arms at the contaminated pots. "The sand is foul, the glass is green, we have nothing to show the Doge but mud." Valerius looked up, his eyes clear and steady. Master, the glass is only green because our eyes have stared at the mud for too long. Clean the mirror within, and the furnace without will have no choice but to follow. Leander scoffed, but something in the boy's unshakable peace pierced his exhausted heart. That day, instead of raging at the crew, Leander joined Valerio in the hourly rhythm. Whenever the bell tolled, they stopped their blowing, took a deep, centering breath, and aligned their minds with the master blueprint of perfection. For weeks, nothing changed in the physical shop. The glass remained tinted, the orders were still delayed. The apprentices whispered that the masters had gone mad. But Leander and Valerio held their ground, treating the hourly reset as an unbreakable anchor. Then, exactly on the 40th day, a strange thing occurred. A merchant vessel from the distant Levant docked at the Murano quay, carrying an unexpected cargo of pure, white quartz sand, a gift meant for another port that had been misdirected by a storm. The captain traded the pure quartz for a fraction of its value, simply to clear his hold. At the same time, the internal atmosphere of the workshop shifted so profoundly that the apprentices stopped their bickering and worked with effortless, joyful harmony. When Leander fired the furnace with the new white quartz, the resulting crystal was so blindingly clear, so free of imperfection, that when it was finally hung in the Doge's palace, it took the breath away of every noble in the assembly. The external world had not changed through brute force. It had simply mirrored the internal conversion that had taken place silently in the hearts of the artisans. The Chronicle of the Murano Glassblowers provides a vital map for every traveler navigating the silent, gradual phases of spiritual transformation. The greatest danger in the path of deliberate creation is the illusion of stagnation, the period where the old physical reality continues to reflect past doubts even though the inner consciousness has already begun to shift. To integrate this truth today, you must master the art of patience during the invisible interval. Recognize that your external world is a delayed action mirror. If you plant a seed in the dark earth, you do not dig it up every hour to see if it is growing. You trust the dark soil, water it with steady discipline, and wait for the stalk to break the surface. The practical exercise for this chapter is the mirror audit. Whenever you encounter a difficult circumstance today, a closed door, a delayed response, a lingering shadow of lack, do not attack the external circumstance as an enemy. Look at it as a messenger. Ask yourself, what internal conversation am I still holding that is projecting this image onto the screen of my life? Then, step back from the mirror. Return to your hourly reset. Adjust the inner reflection, knowing with absolute certainty that as you hold the frequency of the master blueprint, the external mirror has no choice in the end but to reflect the new, magnificent reality. Yet, holding the mirror steady requires an unshakable foundation of sovereign identity. Who are you at the very core of your being? Are you a victim of inherited circumstance, or are you the supreme, conscious architect of your own destiny? The journey ascends now to its final summit, the sovereign choice where the pen is lifted, the final decree is spoken, and the architect steps forever into the radiant light of their own creation. There is a sublime, breathtaking threshold that every conscious traveler must eventually cross, the final moment where the wandering soul steps out of the dark, drafty corridors of inherited circumstance, and stands in the radiant, sunlit courtyard of its own absolute sovereignty. Imagine standing at the edge of a towering cliff at the break of dawn, looking back over the winding, fog-choked valley of past regrets, old complaints, and fearful scribbles where millions of people still wander like sleepwalkers in a maze of their own making. For years, the traveler lived in that valley, convinced that the crooked walls, the chilling drafts, and the heavy doors of limitation were permanent fixtures of an unchangeable fate imposed by an external universe. Yet, as the first golden rays of the sun strike the traveler's face, the illusion evaporates entirely. Looking down at the right hand, the traveler sees the pen, the golden instrument of creation that was always there, held unknowingly through decades of fear. The inciting observation presents the ultimate, unvarnished paradox of human existence. You were never truly broken, never truly abandoned, and never truly a victim of your environment. You were simply an unconscious master builder sketching designs in the dark, handing fearful blueprints to a faithful, literal-minded subconscious crew that had no choice but to build the exact cage you described. Standing at this final precipice, the past falls away like a discarded cloak. The traveler realizes with staggering, spine-tingling clarity that the choice of what to build next has always belonged to them, belongs to them now, and will belong to them for all eternity. There is no one else to blame, no outside force to petition, and no higher authority to wait for. The architect has finally awakened. To explore this ultimate realization with absolute psychological and philosophical rigor requires descending into the deepest vaults of human identity and personal responsibility. Why do human beings fight so desperately against their own sovereignty, clinging to the comforting victimhood of circumstance rather than embracing the terrifying freedom of the architect, deploying recursive thinking? One must probe the protective mechanisms of the ego. Why does the ego prefer the crooked, drafty house of lack over the radiant palace of deliberate creation? Because accountability requires the death of blame. As long as an individual can point an accusing finger at the economy, their upbringing, their genetics, or bad luck, they are absolved of the duty to change. Blame is a warm, narcotizing blanket that shields the ego from the terrifying expanse of its own infinite power. How does the conscious realization of the architect shatter this protective illusion? By demanding an absolute ontological shift. You are the cause, and the world is the effect. There is no separation between the inner creator and the outer creation. How does the subconscious mind respond when the architect finally steps onto the throne with unwavering authority? The faithful construction crew, which previously took orders from panic, casual complaints, and inherited cultural trauma, instantly drops its old tools when presented with a sovereign decree. To answer the deeper question, what is the metaphysical mechanism of ultimate choice? Choice is not a passive preference. It is a spiritual contract. When an individual declares their absolute authority over their reality, they are engaging in a covenant with infinite intelligence. The universe, which is fundamentally structured as a mirror of consciousness, stops reflecting the chaotic noise of external opinion and begins bending its laws, its resources, and its physical matter to serve the clear, uncompromised vision of the awakened soul. The struggle ends. The hustle ceases. The seeker stops begging the sky for bread and recognizes that the storehouse of infinite abundance was always located within the quiet chamber of their own sovereign awareness. Consider the legendary chronicle of the master architect Qian, who lived during the twilight of the ancient dynasties. Qian was renowned across the continent as the supreme builder of his age. Emperors and kings offered him untold fortunes to design their royal palaces, monuments, and temples. Yet, despite his professional acclaim, Qian lived in a state of profound internal exile. He resided in a small, windowless stone hut at the foot of the royal mountain, sleeping on a pallet of straw, wearing rough woolen rags, and believing that his own soul was a ruined quarry, incapable of peace or joy. Whenever his royal patrons asked why the master of grand palaces lived like a beggar in the dirt, Qian would point to his calloused hands and sigh, "I build magnificence for kings, but my own house was cursed at birth by the gods. I am a slave to my heritage of sorrow." Among his apprentices was a young woman named Lyra, who possessed an extraordinary perception of spiritual mechanics. She watched her master design breathtaking arches of marble for the emperor by day, only to return to his dark, freezing hovel and weep over old ledgers of family debt by night. One evening, after Qian had spent hours scratching fearful calculations of poverty into his personal notebook, Lyra stepped quietly across the earthen floor, placed her hand gently over his pen, and pulled the parchment away. "Master Builder," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the damp chill of the hut with crystal clarity. "You spend your days erecting palaces that touch the clouds, and your nights building a dungeon for your own spirit with the exact same hands. Why do you worship the illusion that you are a slave in a house you designed yourself?" Qian glared at her, his eyes blazing with the defensive fury of a man protecting his favorite misery. "You know nothing of my bloodline, child. My fathers were paupers. My house was built upon the quicksand of ruin. I cannot erase the blueprint I was handed at birth. You were handed an old yellowed scribble by people who knew no better. Lyra replied without flinching. You are not a pauper, and you are not a slave. You are Qian the architect. The pen has never left your hand. Every tear you shed is a drop of water you commanded your subconscious crew to haul into your own cellar. The words struck Qian like a lightning bolt passing through iron. He looked down at his own fingers, then around the dark, oppressive walls of his hovel. For the first time in his life, the psychological armor of blame cracked wide open. He saw the terrifying, magnificent truth. He had chosen his misery every morning by picking up the pen of limitation. With trembling hands, Qian took his personal notebook, walked to the hearth, and tossed the old ledgers into the flames. He took a clean, white roll of parchment, dipped his pen in golden ink, and wrote a new decree with a steady, unshakable hand. I am the sovereign architect of my reality. Infinite abundance, radiant peace, and divine order fill my dwelling now, under grace in miraculous ways. He did not wait for the emperor's permission. He did not ask the gods for mercy. He simply claimed his throne. Within months, without changing his profession or seeking new patronage, Qian's personal life underwent a total, miraculous transformation. The stone hut was naturally abandoned as a wealthy estate, bequeathed by an unknown benefactor from a distant province, was placed into his hands. His heart filled with an unshakable, radiant joy. The master had awakened, and reality had no choice but to bow to his sovereign command. The Chronicle of Master Qian is the ultimate mirror for every human soul standing at the crossroads of existence. Transformation is not a distant summit reserved for the spiritually elite. It is the immediate, non-negotiable birthright of anyone willing to drop the heavy burden of victimhood and claim their supreme authority as the architect of their own reality. To integrate this truth today, you must draw a definitive line in the sand. You must recognize that every moment of your past, every crooked wall, every cold draft, and every struggle was simply the logical manifestation of an unconscious blueprint. Do not judge your past self. Thank them for faithfully building whatever instructions you handed down. But recognize that the contract has expired. The practical execution for this final chapter is the sovereign declaration. Stop reading, pause in the sacred stillness of the present moment, and take one deep, grounding breath. Feel the absolute reality of your own consciousness. And now, speak your final, unshakable decree aloud with the complete, thunderous conviction of someone who has reclaimed their crown. I am in perfect harmony with infinite abundance, and all good things flow to me now under grace in miraculous ways. Know that this is not merely a passing thought or a temporary affirmation. It is a sacred vow, a cosmic contract forged between your soul and the infinite intelligence of the universe. The old, fearful scribbles of the past are ash in the hearth. The clean, golden parchment of your new life lies wide open before you, waiting for your hand to guide the pen. And so, as the final bell tolls this chapter to a close, the ultimate question remains suspended in the golden air, waiting for your answer. From this moment forward, which blueprint will you choose to build your life with? The old, fearful scribbles of the past, or the clear, powerful, loving design of the magnificent person you are now becoming? The choice has always been, and will always be, entirely yours.